down and fixed the air conditioner for the gym, and that board was the only problem. As soon as they swapped it out, he said everything started running properly. So it is back up and running in time for Awana, which is a great thing. Esther chapter 6, we'll start with verse 4 and go down through the rest of the chapter this evening. And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king, to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal, whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house, mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife, and all his friends, everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, this evening as we look at this passage, it is obvious that you are working and controlling in the lives of men. And there are things that seem impossible, human speaking, and yet multiple times throughout this account, you absolutely turn something on its head. What seems is destined for wickedness to rule and reign is all of a sudden completely reversed. And you have managed to work through these people in a way to bring such honor and glory to yourself. I trust that we will be aware that you are always on the throne, that it will bring great comfort to us, and that we will remember it in times of difficulty. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. When we last left the king, he is having a sleepless night, and there just so happens, I love that phrase, just so happens that he's having a sleepless night. And it just so happens that he wants to have one of the books of the Chronicles of the King read to him of all the things that he could do to entertain himself. And of course it just so happens that whoever it is that's near to him goes and gets the one that happens to have Mordecai's account in there. And he reads it to him. And he asks him, Paul Harvey, what's the rest of the story? We know who's involved, and we know who the two guys are that are, trying to kill the king, and this is great intrigue, and not exactly the kind of stuff that would put you to sleep. I'm thinking he's probably sitting up excited about hearing this. What did we ever do for that guy? And they realize that they didn't. Well, Haman has had an interlude because he's walking on cloud nine. Things could not be better for this guy. The king's having a sleepless night. And then we get here and we see these two trains that have been heading on opposite sides of the tracks. And Haman thinks he's going the same direction as the king. The king doesn't really care what Haman's doing. He thinks he's, going wide open doing his thing. And what they don't realize is they are about to have a massive wreck for Haman. This is a train wreck of immense proportions. Probably can't get much worse for poor old Haman here. Wondering, how long is it going to take me to get permission from the king to hang Mordecai? Now, we'll talk about it a little bit later when they hang Haman and all his youngins. There's a lot of debate because historically, the Persians didn't hang people from a rope like we would think of hanging someone. The Persians are often credited with where the Romans and some others got the idea of crucifixion. When they hung somebody, they impaled them on a stake, and then they just left them there to die. It's a very cruel way of doing it. But what's worse is afterwards people are like, sometimes they die too quickly. And so they decided to hang them, use the same word, but they would nail their arms and bind their arms to a cross, and then sometimes it would take 2 or 3 days for them to die instead of impaling them, and usually they're dead by sundown. So there's a lot of debate as to whether he is making the gallows, like we would think of, where you tie a rope around somebody, or whether he's just sticking a stake up that high so that everybody could see him as he is dying. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But what I want you to see here is we talked about the king sleepless in Susa. We talked about the importance of the delayed blessing in verse 3, how in God's timing he is bringing all of this up to accomplish the greatest good. And sometimes when we think about a blessing, we think that the blessing that would happen right now would be the greatest good. I don't know about you. There are times that I prayed for something that when I was a teenager, and then years later I thought, man, I am so glad God didn't answer that prayer. Because sometimes for us, the blessing looks like it's going to be just that, a blessing. And we're thinking, boy, this will be wonderful. This would be great. This would be. And then God decides to either wait or he does it in a different way than I anticipate. And while I might be frustrated at the time, usually when I look back, I'm like, I serve a good God and a great God. And he showed up in my behalf in the best way possible. The divine timing in verses 4 and 5, and now we see pride goeth before a fall. Poor Haman is going to have one of those very bad, no good, very bad, rotten days that happen even in Australia. And as the kids' book says. Verses 8 and 9. Haman is going to answer the king, and he just cannot think of anybody else that would possibly be more worthy of this honor. If you think of pride as a pyramid, you have this situation where I feel like Haman has a huge delusion here. Every time I read this and I look into it, I feel like his response when the king asks him about honoring somebody that needs a great honor leads me to believe that Haman kind of wishes that he could be king. I mean, he has already rose about as far as he can rise. The only thing left is if something happened to Ahasuerus, he is pretty set up to take over the throne. There is no mention of a successor, right? It doesn't say anything here about Ahasuerus having children yet. And so if something were to happen to him, maybe Haman's thinking that he's next in line to be the king. And it almost smacks to me of Satan thinking, well, I'm important in heaven, but I could be more important. I want to be like the Most High God. And that same attitude is what I read here and I see here in Haman. I want to be like the Most High. And there's somebody that's higher than me and I don't like it. This delusion. You're going to build this pyramid. Well, he is a prince in Persia, and he's rich and powerful. That's how we're introduced to him, right? And then we find out that he's promoted above all of the princes, and he becomes a prime minister, and he's moved up a little bit. And then there's this edict, and you think, well, it's kind of crazy that the king is going to allow him to do this edict and to kill all these Jewish people. Certainly some of them have to be valuable in some way, shape, or form, but it happens, right? He is allowed to have this edict, and he is given the king's ring. Wow, that's a lot of power. But let's back up to another important edict, because when he becomes really important, the king makes an edict that everybody has to bow to him like he already is royalty. And you can't help but wonder if that doesn't start fueling his ego and his pride. If people are every day, when you're walking down the street, bowing and treating you like royalty, it's not that far of a jump to start thinking, why can't I be royalty? I mean, everybody already treats me like that. Everybody already sees me like that. Then you are invited to a private banquet, and the only people that are at the banquet are the king and the queen. And so you start telling yourself, well, man, I'm in there with my buddy Ahasuerus, and I didn't know Esther thought of me like that too. They must talk about me. Because how else would Esther know, right? She's not in court all the time. The only person that she's really allowed to be around are the chamberlains and or the king. And so the assumption would be, well, they must talk about me all the time. Then after he is invited to this banquet, he goes early because he wants to ask the king something. And notice that he gets access to the king's bedroom. The king hasn't come out into the courtroom yet. He's still pondering what's going on, and he says, well, who's out there in the courtroom? Well, Haman's out there. Well, let him come in. Haman is waiting in the outer room because he doesn't have the right to go into the king's bedroom. If he had permission to be in there on a regular basis, he probably would have knocked on the door and moseyed on in. It's kind of like he's slowly being pushed and pushed up this pyramid of pride. And then he has these preparations for the removal of Mordecai, and he has no reason to believe that it's not going to be granted. And so the king asks him a question. Now, this is a little confusing to me, because often if a person of importance in the Persian Empire wanted to honor someone, they would ask one of their counselors. And they did it for a really good reason. If you ask someone else, then you normally would get an unbiased answer, right? So you know about this situation, but this guy doesn't. And so you would ask them without giving them a lot of details, and they would give you an answer back, and you'd go, okay, let's do that. Because it's an unbiased second opinion type of a situation. But Haman doesn't even think about that. That's the crazy part. And I think that's why God tells us here in his word, he takes so much time to say, well, who else would the king delight to honor other than me? He's not asking any questions. He just can't imagine that someone else would be more desiring. He is in the favorites category with the king, right? And so he doesn't ask any questions. He doesn't get any information. He doesn't even think of Persian protocol. He just thinks, it's got to be me. If Haman could have anything he wanted, that's the way I see this, right? The king says, if I want to honor somebody, how would I go about honoring someone, Haman? And Haman thinks it's him. So really what he says is, if I could have anything I wanted, this would be the time to spill it to the king. This is his biggest dream come true that he is going to outline here. Now think about this for just a minute. Because an hour ago, when he was on the way to the court, the most important thing to him was what? I got to kill Mordecai. Didn't he tell his wife and his friends, man, I just can't have any peace as long as that guy, as long as I see that one. Oh, I can wait almost a year before I kill all the Jews, but I can't stand the sight of that one. If I could get rid of that guy right there, I would be a complete man. And now all of a sudden he walks in here and the king asks him a question, and he doesn't say, well, you could kill his enemy, you could... Nope. Now I want to be treated like the king. And so he brings out these three things, actually four. I want a royal robe that the king wore. That's why it specifically says that the king useth to wear. You don't have to take off your royal garments, king, and just take one of the outer robes. You know, in the movies and the pictures, those things that they always wore over top of their other clothes. Go back in your closet and find one that you wore last week or last month or something and bring that one out. And then get your horse. And notice it says that the king rideth upon. It doesn't say a horse that the king used to ride upon. So he's going to get a coat that the king used to wear. And then he's going to get the horse that the king, if he were getting ready to go somewhere right now, would ride upon. Which means it would be decked out like the king's horse. It would be bridled like the king's horse and saddled like the king's horse, and it would have the customary trappings of the king's horse. And then he says, put the royal crown, and this is a Persian thing, on the horse. They literally would fasten on a king's horse that he would ride, they would fasten it on top of the bridle around its ears. And the word that's used here is a diadem. You read all kinds of commentaries and they're like, well, they wanted that fancy thing, you know, that they put on their forehead. That's not what the word is. The word is literally a circlet crown. And so I looked it up, and it was a Persian thing. Oftentimes, when the king was riding somewhere, instead of having the crown bouncing up and down on his head, they would put it on the horse's head and tie it to the bridle. Now listen. The whole idea is everybody knows that this is Air Force One, right? You see Air Force One land at an airport and you know who's on it. There's only one person that gets to fly on Air Force One. It's not Air Force One if that person isn't on it. It's designated something else. Even if the vice president is on it, it's not Air Force One, right? So what he's asking here is, in every way, shape, or form, I want to be identified as if I were king for a day. That's what he's asking for. And then, to make sure that everybody knows, you get an important prince. The nobler, the better. Because important people did important things, right? And so imagine this. If the vice president of the United States, if our president wanted to honor somebody and he wanted to get somebody to walk around and introduce them, the next most important person in the United States that you could get would be Vice President Vance. So you're going to say, oh yeah, I want Vice President Vance to lead me around on your horse wearing your clothes, identifying like you for a day, and what he is going to holler as they go through the streets is, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. So over and over and over again, like a town crier, this important prince is going to walk along leading the horse and crying this thing out street by street until he has gone through every street in the city. Then he's allowed to return back to the palace. The decision in verse 10, it doesn't take the king any time at all. Let's do it. King said to Haman, "Make haste, take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. You be the herald." Oh boy. And we're going to honor Mordecai, and he just doesn't call him Mordecai, he calls him what? Mordecai the Jew. Gets honored just exactly like you said. Now, the king knows who saved him, because that's the whole reason that he's being honored. The king knows that he is a Jew because he just said it. And the king knows, but he seems to have forgotten, who is responsible for the edict to slaughter all the Jews. And God is bringing it all out ahead of time, because we're going to turn the page to chapter 7, and guess what's going to come out at the second banquet? Pride goeth before the fall, right? Look at the fall, verses 11 and 12. Then Haman took the apparel and the horse and arrayed Mordecai. That doesn't sound like much, right? Where do you put the king's garments on the king? Did he take this stuff out to the gate where Mordecai was and clothe him and get the... No. Somebody went out and got Mordecai and took him into the palace somewhere, certainly not the king's bedroom or the king's chambers, but they took him into the palace somewhere, and they dressed him up to look like the king, and then they walked him down out of the palace to the horse that was waiting, and he rode out of the palace complex into the streets. Wow. And the whole time, Haman is sitting there furious because somebody else is living his dream. The king asked him, how would I honor somebody? And he thought it was going to be him. If I could have the deep down desire of my heart, I'd love to be king for a day. And now his enemy is riding the king's horse and not the gallows. Boy, how God has turned that thing on its head. The king probably doesn't know about the tiff, right? He doesn't know what's going on between Mordecai and Haman. But as soon as Haman leads Mordecai out of the palace complex, he has to pass through the gate. And who started all the nonsense about the edict? Oh yeah. All of Mordecai's co-workers are probably sitting there going, oh yeah, that's why you didn't bow to that guy. Why are we bowing to that guy if you don't have to bow to that guy? And now that guy is honoring this guy after he signed an edict to kill him in less than a year. Can you imagine what it was like for Haman to holler that out? And listen, you don't walk down the streets going, yeah, this is what we're going to do to anybody that does pretty good by the king, because the king's going to hear about it. He said, you do everything that you said and make sure you don't fail in any of it. That poor guy has to stand there and hold that horse's bridle and walk beside his enemy and treat him like royalty, even though Mordecai refused to treat him like royalty. It had to sting all day long. Can you imagine? They start down the first street and people turn and start whispering, because even though the king doesn't know what's going on, all those people out there on the streets know what's going on. Unreal. Pride goeth before a fall. You get to spend the day as a servant to your enemy instead of being king for a day. Tell me God isn't working. Look at the finale in verse 12. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate. That means he went through the entire city, street by street, with Haman hollering. They get back to the gate. He's going to get off the horse, going to go into the palace, take off the king's clothes, and then it says, and Mordecai came again to the king's gate. Mordecai went back to work at the king's gate. Doesn't say he strutted out to the king's gate going, Yep, told y'all. There's a reason I don't bow to that loser. Because he's the one that'll be leading my horse around. Nope. Mordecai understands who was at work behind the scenes. And he goes back out to the gate because being at the gate is where he can be the most help to Esther, and Esther's getting ready to have her second banquet. And I wonder if Esther even knows what's going on between Mordecai and Haman. Because if she's preparing a banquet and getting dressed, unless somebody goes in and tells her what's going on, she would not know. But old Haman, he is humiliated. Look at the end of verse 12. Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. Mourning means to lament audibly. I would imagine this guy was belly aching from the time he left the gate. He probably waited till he was out of earshot of Mordecai. But all the way home, he is out loud belly aching because you couldn't have a more miserable day than what this is. And it says he has his head covered. I believe he had his head covered because he's pulling a movie star. Movie stars want to go out in public and they don't want a bunch of people to recognize them. They put on a baseball hat or they put on sunglasses or they do their hair differently and they sneak out of their house a different way and they show up at a party or whatever, hoping that nobody recognizes them until they get to where they're going. That's exactly what I see Haman doing here. He puts his thing up over his head and he boot gangs through the people because they're all probably talking about him and laughing. Be my guess. What else do you have to laugh about at the palace? Then verses 13 and 14, Haman, part 2. Boy, the first time he went home, he was having a good day. He was whistling a whole different tune, and he was singing and having a good time, and he calls for his wife, and he calls for all his friends, and he's doing all this bragging. And this time when he goes home, he told Zeresh and his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. It is a completely different story this time. But on the way home, he doesn't get any comfort from the citizens. Now think about this. If they recognize Haman, what are they supposed to do by edict of the king? You'd think that'd make you happy, right? I mean, maybe the day hasn't gone the way you want to, but you leave the gates and you head for home, and every single citizen that you pass is supposed to bow. You'd think that maybe that would make you feel a little better. But here's this guy with his cloak or something over top of his head, and he's hurrying through the streets. He doesn't know if people are bowing. He don't even care. He does not want to be recognized. There's no comfort from them. There's no success in his plans because when he came home, he was supposed to come home knowing that Mordecai was about to be hung. Comes home to comfort and companionship, my wife and my friends. Now what's interesting here, the Bible uses two different words. In verse 13, a friends is Ahab, which means someone that you care about, a friend. But the wise men is Kakam, which means wise man or counselor. And what I find so interesting about this is in verse 13, when you go back and he's getting ready to make the gallows and he's bragging to everybody, and they're not mentioned in chapter 5. It doesn't say anything about the wise men being present. So it's almost, I don't know if his friends were his wise men, but here they're described as wise men, and up until this point, every time they're referred to as a friend. And this poor guy is looking for some comfort. He's looking for some support. And look at what they say to him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh's wife unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. In other words, they say, your future is looking dim, dude. I mean, this is not, I don't know how you spin this, because this doesn't look good. If Mordecai is of the seed of the Jews, that is a very important phrase. Makes you wonder what they knew and what they were putting together here and why they are making this statement. You just honored someone at the king's command that you were responsible for killing. Maybe that's it. Or maybe they knew from history how God has used the Jews from Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel all the way up until now. Boy, I don't know, buddy. You might have picked a fight with the wrong person, because it seems like in every single major king that has been on the throne all the way back from Babylonian days, now to Persian days, there has been a huge Jewish influence. And maybe you picked a fight with the wrong person. Or maybe they are familiar with Israel's past and God's promise to wipe out the Amalekites. And at first they were thinking, well, you got him. Make this big gallows and hang him. And now they're going, uh-oh, God showed up. It's hard to say which of the three things are going through their heads. But when we look at it, you can look at it and say, God has shown up. If that isn't bad enough, he hates the Jews and he wants to kill them all. And now, if Mordecai's of the seed of the Jews, I don't know there, buddy. Well, it's too late to change the edict, right? But their second phrase, before whom thou hast begun to fall. That is start of movement the other way. He has been ascending up this pyramid of pride, and he thought he was going to get to the top where he would get to be king for a day, and now these people that's supposed to care about him are like, I don't know, buddy, you might be sliding down the sides of that pyramid a little bit. But if you've begun to fall, you can say, well, I can stop it, right? Or I can turn it around. What do I need to do to turn it around and start climbing back up so I can be where I want to be? But then the last two phrases are like nailing the coffin shut. Because he says, you shall not prevail against who? It says him. Thou shalt not prevail against. It doesn't say the Jews. It specifically says the one guy that he absolutely cannot stand. That is a personal statement. Your friends and your wise men and your wife are looking at you and going, buddy, you can't beat him. Imagine that. Boxer getting ready to go in the ring, and all the folks that are working with you and your trainer and your wife show up there by the side of the ring and look at you and go, well, have at it, but I hate to tell you, you can't beat that guy. Just exactly what you want to hear when you're in the midst of it. But it gets worse, because they finish by saying, you shall surely fall. And notice, they didn't say might not. They said shall not. You might not prevail against him? Well, that makes you think maybe there's some hope that maybe you will. No, they said you shall not. And they said you shall surely fall. You can count on it. You talk about a no good, very bad day. And his attitude is probably as low as it can go. And we hit verse 14. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains, and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. Next week we get into Wine and Dine Part 2. But he is now dreading today what was a remarkable honor yesterday. And these two trains are about to hit each other smack dab on, because the king is excited. He has just honored somebody that saved his life. He gets to go to a second banquet with the queen, and today she's going to tell him what she wants, so he doesn't have to wonder about it anymore. And so he sends the chamberlains. He probably wasn't expecting Haman to leave the palace, right? He's up there honoring Mordecai. He figured when he got rid of the horse and put the clothes away that he'd come in to see the king. Instead, he ran to the house. And so here's the king waiting to go to the banquet. And who's he have to wait on? Kings don't like to have to wait on anybody. And so the chamberlains are hasting because the king anxiously wants to go to the banquet. And now all of a sudden Haman, he's really not so sure about this. What was up there just under the pinnacle, I get to dine at a special banquet with just the king and queen, is all ruined for him. And you think, can't get any worse. Oh yeah, it can. Wait till you get to the banquet.